In the history of the Oakland and Los Angeles Raiders, only 3 men have ever walked off a football field holding a Super Bowl Most Valuable Player trophy. 3 men, across more than 6 decades of this franchise's existence. Here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. 2 of those 3 men were actual teammates. The same silver and black, the same locker room, the same building, not different eras entirely. Actual teammates for one specific, quietly forgettable season, where absolutely nothing about either man's career looked like it was heading anywhere near Canton, Ohio. One of them was already a legend, closing out the final chapter of his career. The other was a former Heisman Trophy winner that 2 different NFL franchises had already thrown away, hanging onto his job by a thread, buried so deep on the depth chart that he didn't take a single regular season snap that year. Neither man had the slightest idea, sitting in that locker room in 1978, that they were both destined to hold the exact same trophy, years apart, for completely different reasons, in completely different games. This is the story of Fred Biletnikoff and Jim Plunkett, 2 men who, on paper, had almost nothing in common. One was a polished, sure-handed veteran who'd already been to the mountaintop. The other was a former Golden Boy who'd been humiliated by 2 different franchises and was one bad season away from disappearing from the league entirely. If you'd asked anyone in that Oakland facility in 1978 which of these 2 men still had something historic left in the tank, almost nobody would have guessed both of them. And yes, before the comments start filling up, we are going to address Marcus Allen too, because his name absolutely belongs in this conversation, whether the title of this video mentions him or not. Stick around, because the full picture here is stranger and better than a simple trivia fact. Quick ask before we get into it. If you're into these deep dives into Raiders history, hit subscribe now. It costs nothing, and there's a lot more where this came from. The Raiders' way to understand how these 2 men ever ended up in the same building, you have to understand what the Raiders actually were, at their core. This wasn't a franchise stocked with can't-miss, blue-chip Golden Boys. Under Al Davis, first as a young head coach, then later as the franchise's controlling owner, the Raiders built their entire identity around players other teams had already given up on. Misfits, reclamation projects. Guys with a chip on their shoulder and something left to prove, commitment to excellence was the slogan on the wall. Just win, baby, was the philosophy underneath it. Nobody in that building cared how you got there, only whether you could still help them win on Sunday. Other franchises at the time ran from that kind of roster gamble. Al Davis ran straight at it, year after year, and more often than not it paid off in championships. That single organizational philosophy is exactly how both men in this story ended up wearing the same jersey. It's also why the Raiders, more than almost any other franchise of that era, developed a reputation as pro football's collection of outlaws and outcasts. The black uniforms, the pirate logo, the fan base in the Oakland Coliseum that eventually earned the nickname the Black Hole. Other front offices looked at a discarded former star or an unheralded small school prospect and saw a risk not worth the roster spot. Al Davis looked at the same player and saw an opportunity nobody else was willing to take. Fred Biletnikoff, the legend on his way out. Let's start with Fred Biletnikoff, because chronologically, his story comes first. Biletnikoff was born in Erie, Pennsylvania, the son of Russian immigrants, and he became a consensus All-American wide receiver at Florida State, once hauling in 4 touchdown passes in a single Gator Bowl performance against Oklahoma. By 1965, 2 separate professional leagues wanted him. The Detroit Lions took him in the 3rd round of the NFL draft. A young Raiders coach named Al Davis grabbed him 1 round earlier, in the 2nd round of the rival American Football League draft. Biletnikoff chose Oakland, signing with Davis almost immediately after that Gator Bowl performance, and he never played for another organization again in either league. Here's the thing about Biletnikoff, though. He wasn't fast. He didn't have blazing, defensive back panicking speed. What he had was precision. Route running so exact and so repeatable that it barely mattered that everybody in the stadium, including the opposing coaching staff, knew the ball was coming his way. He'd still find a way to get open. He became famous for coating his hands and forearms in a sticky substance called stickum, and over 14 seasons in Oakland, he turned himself into one of the most dependable pass catchers of his generation, missing only 8 games to injury in his entire career. It didn't come easily right away either. Biletnikoff didn't walk into the league as a finished product. Early in his rookie season, he had to earn his way onto the field, and once he finally got extended playing time, he answered with a 7-catch, 118-yard performance that made him a full-time starter for good. From that point forward, he simply never gave the job back. The Raiders, though, made him wait for glory. Oakland reached the AFL-NFL World Championship game, what we'd now call Super Bowl II, back in the 1967 season, and lost badly to Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers. For the better part of the next decade, the Raiders were one of the most talented, most consistently heartbroken teams in football, running into playoff disappointment after playoff disappointment, most infamously against the Pittsburgh Steelers. By the numbers, Biletnikoff finished his career with 589 receptions, 8,974 receiving yards, and 76 touchdowns, a franchise scoring record for receivers that, decades later, still stands. He set what was then an NFL record of 10 straight seasons catching 40 or more passes. He made 4 Pro Bowls and earned first-team All-Pro honors twice. But it was one single afternoon, January 9, 1977, that came to define his entire 14 years in the league. In Super Bowl XI, the Raiders finally broke through, blowing out the Minnesota Vikings 32-14 for the franchise's first championship, while handing the Vikings their 4th Super Bowl loss without a win to show for any of them. Biletnikoff caught only 4 passes that day, a quiet number by modern standards. But every single one of them was a dagger, setting up 3 separate Oakland touchdowns at exactly the moments the Raiders needed points most. He never actually found the end zone himself in that game, which makes the MVP award even more of a testament to just how much the rest of the offense depended on him simply getting open. He was named the game's most valuable player. Biletnikoff himself later said he thought his own quarterback, Ken Stabler, deserved the award just as much. The voters disagreed. 11 years later, in the summer of 1988, Biletnikoff got the phone call every player dreams about: enshrinement into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, presented, fittingly, by the same man who had signed him as an unproven rookie more than 2 decades earlier, Al Davis. Jim Plunkett, the reject nobody wanted now. Here's where the story turns. Because in that very same locker room during Biletnikoff's 14th and final season in 1978, a completely different, far bleaker story was quietly playing out. One that, at the time, looked like nothing more than a sad footnote to a once promising career that had already gone sideways. Jim Plunkett's career started about as high as a college football career can start. Born in San Jose, California to Mexican-American and Cherokee heritage, Plunkett grew up the son of 2 legally blind parents. His father worked as a newsstand vendor despite his own failing sight, and young Jim took on odd jobs growing up, from gas station attendant to grocery clerk to construction laborer, to help support the family. Out of Stanford, he won the Heisman Trophy in 1970, becoming the first Latino and Native American player to win the award, and set NCAA records for career passing yards and total offense along the way. The New England Patriots made Plunkett the first overall pick in the 1971 NFL Draft, and he won Rookie of the Year honors in his debut season. And then, over the next several years, it all came apart. Behind a struggling offensive line, Plunkett was sacked relentlessly and threw far more interceptions than touchdowns as the Patriots stumbled through losing season after losing season. New England traded him to the San Francisco 49ers in 1976, hoping a fresh start closer to home might turn things around. It didn't. After a rough 1977 campaign, the 49ers released him outright during the 1978 preseason. At 30 years old, discarded by 2 different NFL franchises, Jim Plunkett was staring down the end of a career that had once promised so much. That's when Al Davis picked up the phone. Davis signed Plunkett to a 3-year contract, strictly as a third-string backup, and reportedly told him to take all the time he needed to put himself back together, physically and mentally. Plunkett didn't throw a single regular season pass in 1978, the exact same season Fred Biletnikoff was catching his final passes as a Raider. 2 men, 1 locker room, one of them closing out a legendary career on his own terms, the other buried so deep on the depth chart that he barely existed as a football player that year. Neither one had the faintest idea what was still ahead of him. In 1979, Plunkett threw a grand total of 15 passes all season. Then, 5 weeks into the 1980 campaign, starting quarterback Dan Pastorini broke his leg. Plunkett got the call off the bench, and his first outing was rough, 5 interceptions in a loss. But with no better options on the roster, the Raiders committed to him as the starter for the rest of the year. What followed is one of the great redemption stories in NFL history. Plunkett led Oakland to 11 wins and a wild-card playoff berth, then guided the Raiders through 3 straight road playoff upsets. First came a win over the Houston Oilers. Then a trip to frozen Cleveland where the Raiders escaped with a 14-12 divisional round win over the Browns in a game still remembered for Cleveland's disastrous final drive, when a pass into the end zone was intercepted in the closing seconds instead of simply kicking a short, game-tying field goal in the bitter cold. Then a win in San Diego to punch their ticket to the Super Bowl, making the Raiders the first wildcard team in NFL history to reach it. In Super Bowl 15, Plunkett threw for 261 yards and 3 touchdowns as the Raiders dismantled the Philadelphia Eagles 27-10. He was named Super Bowl MVP and took home the league's Comeback Player of the Year award in the same season. According to the Raiders' own team historians, Plunkett also became the first Latino quarterback in NFL history to win a Super Bowl and be named the game's MVP. 3 years later, in the 1983 season, Plunkett did it again, stepping in for an injured Mark Wilson and leading the now relocated Los Angeles Raiders to a dominant 38-9 demolition of Washington in Super Bowl 18. The Marcus Allen wrinkle now: in that Super Bowl 18 blowout, Plunkett wasn't the one who took home the MVP trophy. That honor belonged to a young running back named Marcus Allen in just his second NFL season, who tore through the Washington defense for 191 rushing yards on just 20 carries, including one of the most iconic runs in Super Bowl history, a play that was completely blown up at the line of scrimmage, forcing Allen to plant his foot, reverse field entirely, and sprint the other direction before turning it into a 74-yard touchdown that still shows up on highlight reels today. It remains one of the signature plays in the history of the Super Bowl itself, let alone Raiders history. And this is exactly where some of you are already ahead of me. If Marcus Allen also won Super Bowl MVP as a Raider, and he was standing on the very same field as Jim Plunkett that day, taking handoffs directly from him, doesn't that make Plunkett and Allen a pair of Raiders teammates who both won Super Bowl MVPs too? Yes. Honestly, credit where it's due. That pairing exists as well, and it deserves its own recognition. If we're being fully precise, there are technically 2 valid combinations sitting inside Raiders history: Biletnikoff and Plunkett and Allen. Jim Plunkett, it turns out, is the connective thread running through this entire story. The one man who was teammates with both of the other 2 Super Bowl MVPs in franchise history, at completely different points in his own career. But here's what makes the Biletnikoff-Plunkett connection genuinely different, and honestly more remarkable. Plunkett and Marcus Allen were teammates for roughly half a decade, from Allen's rookie season in 1982 all the way through Plunkett's final years in the league, and they shared an actual championship together on the same field. Plunkett handed the ball off and opened up the exact offense that Allen used to become MVP that day. That's a direct on-field partnership between 2 stars of the same era, standing in the same huddle. Biletnikoff and Plunkett never once played in a Super Bowl together. They crossed paths for exactly one quiet, unremarkable season, years before either man's championship moment. Biletnikoff had already delivered the biggest performance of his career. Plunkett had no idea his own biggest performance was still 2 years away, sitting on a clipboard, unsure if he'd ever start another NFL game again. They didn't win anything side by side. They simply happened to occupy the same locker room, at the precise hinge point where one Raiders era was ending and the next one hadn't yet begun, before each of them, entirely separately, went on to answer the exact same trivia question. That's not really a partnership in the traditional sense. It's something stranger and honestly more poetic, a relay handoff neither man realized he was even part of at the time. One man's very last season as a Raider quietly overlapped with another man's very first, and neither one could have possibly known that history was about to connect them forever, or that a third man, still years away from even being drafted, would eventually complete the circle. If this is the kind of Raiders trivia you didn't already know walking in, do me a favor and hit the like button. It genuinely helps this video get in front of other Raiders fans who'd want to see the full story, and it's the easiest way to support the channel without spending a cent. It also tells YouTube this is exactly the kind of deep dive content this audience wants more of, which means more videos like this one get made. 3 trophies, 1 franchise, 3 Raiders Super Bowl MVPs, across 3 separate championships, spanning 3 completely different chapters of the franchise's identity. Fred Biletnikoff represents the gritty, old-school AFL-era Raiders, finally breaking through after a decade of playoff heartbreak. Jim Plunkett represents the ultimate Al Davis reclamation project, a former superstar rebuilding his career from absolute rock bottom. And Marcus Allen represents the flashy, must-see Los Angeles Raiders of the early 80s, must-watch television every single Sunday. What actually connects all three of them isn't just a trophy. It's a franchise that, for one remarkable stretch of football history, consistently found greatness in players everybody else had already written off. A receiver without blazing speed, a quarterback two franchises had discarded, and a few years later, a rookie running back nobody was fully certain would translate to the pro game. All three of them proved every doubter wrong, on the exact same stage, wearing the exact same silver and black. And somewhere in the middle of all that, for one quiet, forgettable season in 1978, a legend on his way out shared a locker room with a nobody on his way back in, neither one aware that history was about to link them together forever. It's worth sitting with that for a second. Somewhere in that Oakland facility, Jim Plunkett was almost certainly watching Fred Biletnikoff run his precise, unglamorous routes in practice, probably wondering if he himself would ever meaningfully play football again, let alone stand on a Super Bowl podium. Biletnikoff, for his part, was simply trying to finish out a great career on his own terms. Neither of them could have possibly guessed that a future Hall of Fame bust and a piece of Raiders trivia were quietly being written in the same building, at the exact same time. Both men's stories eventually led back to Canton. Biletnikoff was inducted in 1988. Plunkett, despite 2 Super Bowl rings, an MVP award, and one of the most complete redemption arcs in league history, has never been enshrined. A genuinely debatable Hall of Fame snub in its own right, and maybe a story for another video on this channel down the line. It's a strange kind of symmetry, when you think about it. The receiver who was doubted for not being fast enough got his bronze bust decades ago. The quarterback who was doubted for simply not being good enough anymore is still waiting on his phone call, even after doing something only a small handful of men in NFL history have ever done, winning multiple Super Bowls as the starting quarterback. 2 men, 1 brief season together, 2 very different endings still being written. So the next time somebody brings up Super Bowl MVPs in an argument at a bar, you've got a fact almost nobody else in the room will know. In over 60 years of Raiders football, only 3 men have ever won that trophy, and 2 of them shared a building for one completely unremarkable season, long before either man had any idea what was actually still coming. And if that same friend tries to argue that Marcus Allen breaks the whole premise, you'll already know exactly how to answer them, because you just watched the full story. Let me know in the comments, which path to that trophy hits harder for you? Biletnikoff, the steady legend, finally getting his signature moment after a decade of near misses? Plunkett, the guy 2 different franchises had already thrown away? Or Allen, the one who tied the whole story together without even realizing it? Drop your take down below, and if you know a die-hard Raiders fan who's never heard this connection before, tag them in the comments too. And if you enjoyed this one, go ahead and subscribe, and share it with a fellow Raiders fan who needs to hear this story. Every like, every comment, and every share tells YouTube to put more of this channel's content in front of people who care about this team's history as much as you clearly do. There's a lot more buried in this franchise's past worth digging up, so I'll see you in the next one.